The hills of Sicily are not silent. To the outsider they may seem still, ancient ridges of rock rising and falling against a horizon painted gold by the late Mediterranean sun. But listen carefully, and the air carries a language of its own. Cicadas chant in endless rhythm, their song weaving through the olive groves. The wind, dry and restless, brushes over the brittle grass and the stones that have stood here longer than memory. Beneath this expanse of sound and silence, nestled between slopes that glow amber in the dusk, lies the town of Corleone. At first glance, Corleone could be mistaken for just another Sicilian village, its houses clustered tightly together. Their walls are fading ochre, its narrow streets paved in cobblestone, polished by centuries of footsteps. Smoke from kitchen hearths curls into the air, carrying with it the scent of bread and garlic, mingling with dust and the faint bitterness of earth. A church bell tolls, and its echo rolls gently across the valley, as though the hills themselves are repeating the sound in solemn agreement. Yet Corleone has another voice, one that does not announce itself so openly. It is quieter, more elusive, carried not in song or prayer, but in whispers. Conversations drift between shuttered windows and shadowed doorways. A nod here, a glance, their gestures, so small they might escape the notice of a stranger, but never of someone who belongs. These are the murmurs of vendetta, of debts that outlive lifetimes, of pacts formed in secrecy. The town breathes this language as naturally as air, and those born here learn its grammar before they ever speak aloud. It was into this world that Salvatore Riina came, in the winter of 1930. To the people of Corleone, he was simply Toto, the son of a man who had little and a woman who bore more hardship than joy. His childhood unfolded in the years when Sicily and much of the world trembled from the scars of war. Hunger was not a misfortune, but a daily companion, etched into the hollow stomachs of children and the weary eyes of their mothers. Poverty pressed down like the relentless sun, leaving little room for dreams beyond survival. For Toto, loss arrived early. His father, a man who sought opportunity where there was none, died when his boy was still young. The circumstances of that death carried the cruel irony of desperation, in search of fortune. He had attempted to recover explosives left from the war, hoping to resell them. A single mistake reduced him to fragments of memory and silence, leaving behind a widow and children to navigate a world even harsher than before. For the Riina family, the absence of a father was more than grief, was a void filled with hunger, with a sudden and merciless demand for resilience. The hills of Corleone watched silently as Toto grew. His boyhood years marked less by play and laughter than by a sharpening awareness of how power moved, unseen but undeniable. He saw how men stepped aside when certain figures passed, how silence became a shield in a place where the wrong word could turn fatal. The Mafia was not a shadowy myth here. It was an inheritance, woven into the rhythm of the village. It lingered in the gestures of men at the cafe, in the hushed bargaining after church, in the stories told only after dark. For the child who had lost too much, too soon, this atmosphere offered both explanation and temptation. In Corleone, power was not measured in wealth or education luxuries that poverty forbade, but in the ability to command respect or fear without speaking a word. The young Riina absorbed this truth as naturally as he absorbed the taste of bread dipped in oil, the scent of wood smoke in winter. His childhood hardened him, not in sudden moments, but gradually, like stone formed by centuries of wind. And yet, the town around him remained beautiful, almost cruelly so. On mornings when the mist clung to the valleys, Corleone seemed like a village suspended between heaven and earth. The hills glowed with wildflowers in spring, and in autumn the vineyards stretched deep with color. Life here was always lived in contrast, beauty that made one pause, and brutality that demanded one never look too long. It is easy to imagine Toto, a boy in patched clothes, standing at the edge of those hills, staring into the distance where the horizon blurred into the sea. Did he dream then of escape? Or did he already understand, even as a child, that Corleone was not a place one left, but a place that shaped and claimed you, whether you wished it or not? The whispers of the town left little room for innocence. In Corleone, silence was survival, obedience was protection, and fear was a legacy passed from father to son. This is where the story begins, not with the rise of a feared boss, not with the violence that would one day shake Italy to its core, but with a child walking the narrow streets of a town that kept its secrets like a clenched fist. Monsters, after all, are not born in darkness. They are raised in the daylight of ordinary skies, under the same sun that warms the olive groves, amidst the same laughter of children who play in dusty squares. As the last light of day fades from the Sicilian hills, the cicadas fall quiet, and Corleone seems to hold its breath. Somewhere in those silent streets, a boy lies awake, listening to the creak of the house settling to his mother's weary movements, to the far-off murmur of men talking outside. He does not know it yet, but the world is already watching him. History itself leans in closer, waiting, and so, beneath the whispering hills, a story begins, one of poverty and power, of silence and blood. The air is heavy, charged with the weight of what is yet to come. The village sleeps, but its whispers never do. The hills of Corleone were quiet at dusk. Shadows stretched across narrow alleys, softening the jagged outlines of stone walls. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the scent of wood fires lingered in the evening air. It was here, in this quiet Sicilian town, that Salvatore Riina, 17, crossed the invisible threshold between adolescence and the shadowed world of the Mafia. He was not born with power. He had no wealth, no pedigree that set him apart. To most, Riina was forgettable, a short, stocky boy with downcast eyes and a silence that seemed almost submissive. Yet silence, in Corleone, was never weakness. It was the first lesson in survival. To be silent was to listen, to observe, to know when to act. And soon, silence would become his most dangerous weapon. The transformation began not with a carefully planned crime, but with a moment of recklessness. A petty theft. A boy's clumsy attempt to take what was not his. Yet Sicily, in the mid-20th century, was not forgiving. The lines between survival and damnation were thin. That single act spiraled into violence, and when the dust settled, blood had been spilled. For most boys, such a moment would inspire fear, even remorse. But for Riina, it marked something else, an awakening. The shock of blood on his hands did not repulse him. It clarified him. It was as if the land itself, its soil, nourished by centuries of feuds and vendettas, had claimed him. The act did not isolate him from the men around him. Instead, it drew them closer. They recognized something in him, something that could not be taught, a readiness for brutality. He was noticed, the rising bosses of Corleone, men hardened by years of silence and strategy, began to look at the boy with a new kind of attention, a nod in passing, a gesture to join them in the shadows of the piazza. These were not open invitations, they were tests. Subtle acknowledgements that he had crossed a line and could never return. Riina, who had once blended into the crowd, was now singled out for his capacity to act without hesitation. His first arrest came swiftly. A night in a prison cell, damp with the smell of mildew, walls heavy with silence. The air tasted of iron, and water dripped endlessly in the darkness. For many, such confinement was meant to instill fear, a warning against future trespasses. But for Riina, it was initiation. The cell became a classroom, and the other men behind bars were his tutors. They spoke of loyalty, of betrayal, of the cost of weakness. Their words carved into him deeper than any punishment could. When he emerged, he carried their lessons not as burdens, but as a creed. The true baptism, however, came not from theft or arrest, but from murder. It was not done in haste. It was not a flare of uncontrollable rage. It was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The village was hushed after the gunshot. Windows closed quietly, doors locked without question. And in that silence, Riina felt the world tilt. He had taken life, and in doing so, had offered proof of his belonging. There was no celebration, no applause. Instead, there was recognition. The respectful nod of an older man who saw in Riina not a boy, but a soldier. A young man who had learned the language of power in its rawest form. This was the paradox that defined him. On the surface, Riina was unremarkable, his stature small, his presence easily overlooked. He could walk into a room and pass as nobody. Yet beneath that exterior lived something volatile. His violence, when unleashed, was precise, unflinching, and absolute. To the world he was you, Kirchu, the short one, but among those who mattered, he was becoming something far larger, a figure whose brutality was both feared and valued. Each act of violence deepened the transformation. It was not chaos, but ritual, a dark baptism, step by step. With each body, each prison cell, each nod of approval, he was submerged deeper into the current of mafia life. And like baptism, it washed away what he had been before. The boy from the hills no longer existed. In his place stood the apprentice of death, an initiate in an ancient brotherhood where cruelty was currency. The rhythm of his life became tied to this silent order. The smell of damp earth after rain, where bodies could be buried without trace. The hollow stillness of nights when gunshots shattered the air, followed by the suffocating quiet that fell on villagers too afraid to mourn. The look in people's eyes as they glanced away, complicit in their silence. Unwilling to speak of what they all knew in those silences, Riina grew. He understood instinctively that fear was not born from spectacle, but from whispers. A man who flaunted his violence was reckless, doomed. But a man whose violence was quiet, whose killings left only the faintest echo, he inspired a deeper dread. Riina embraced this. He became a ghost who walked among them, invisible until the moment he chose to act. By the late 1950s, his name was already spoken carefully. He was still young, but no longer underestimated. The bosses of Corleone had seen his resolve, and they welcomed him further into their circle. He was not yet a leader, but the path was opening. A path paved by blood, silence, and inevitability. And so, the boy was gone. In his place stood Salvatore Riina, apprentice to the Mafia, initiate in its dark rites. His baptism had been completed, not with water, but with blood. The villagers who once overlooked him now avoided his gaze. Mothers pulled their children closer when he passed. Men, older and stronger, lowered their voices when his name surfaced. All understood what he had become, though none would say it aloud. By the end of his teenage years, Riina's destiny was no longer uncertain. The choices had been made, the road set before him. He had chosen, yes, but the world around him had also chosen for him. A society that rewarded brutality and punished mercy had molded him into exactly what it required. It was only the beginning. The young man from Corleone had stepped fully into the shadows, and those shadows would never let him go. The beast was stirring. The story of Cosa Nostra, until the 1970s, had always been written in the voices of Palermo, the capital city of Sicily, with its grand boulevards, faded aristocracy, and its neighborhoods thick with secrets, dictated the rhythms of power. Mafia dynasties there held themselves with a certain style, men who dressed well, spoke carefully, and carried themselves with a code of honor that, at least outwardly, mimicked the old Sicilian nobility to them. The countryside clans were little more than muscle, hired hands. They saw Corleone, an inland town, poor, harsh, tucked away among the mountains, as rustic, unsophisticated, even laughable. Its men, hardened by soil and stone, were considered too coarse to sit at the tables where real strategy was plotted. But in the shadows of that contempt, a new order was gathering. It was being built not on charm, nor on the half-romantic notions of honor, but on something colder, heavier, and far less forgiving. Salvatore Riina, Luciano, and Bernardo Provenzano, the trinity of Corleone, would change the mafia forever. Together, they embodied something that the Palermo bosses underestimated: the ruthless patience of men who had lived in the margins, and who had decided that the margins would no longer suffice. It began with Luciano, a figure both magnetic and terrifying. He had risen by sheer brutality, stepping into leadership after orchestrating the murder of his own boss, Michele Nabarra. In Leggio, Riina found his path, his mentor. The man who taught him that power was not negotiated, was taken, and once taken, it was held by fear. If Leggio was the architect, Riina was the stone that built the walls, solid and immovable, and Provenzano, quiet, meticulous, almost invisible, was the mortar that bound it all together. He was the strategist, the one who could draw maps of alliances and betrayals in the air, and then execute them with eerie calm. The Corleonesi were not interested in sharing the table in Palermo. They wanted to flip the table over, and slowly, through silence, cruelty, and an almost religious discipline, they began their climb. Meetings in Palermo's city apartments, casual, full of cigarettes and laughter, took on a new tension when whispers of Corleone entered the room. Rival bosses scoffed at first. How could men from a farming town, men who still carried the dust of the fields on their shoes, presume to dictate the future of Cosa Nostra? But the scoffing turned to silence, and the silence turned to fear. For the Corleonesi had a way of answering doubt not with debate, not with persuasion, but with disappearance. A consigliere would go missing, a mid-level captain found shot, not in public, but left in a ditch. The earth itself, closing over him like a warning, whispered to the living. There was no speech, no proclamation. The message was written in the absence of men who, only days before, had seemed untouchable. Their ascent was not chaos. It was not reckless. It was a rhythm, a slow tightening of a noose around Palermo. In back rooms thick with cigarette smoke, alliances shifted. Some swore loyalty out of calculation, others out of sheer terror. The Corleonesi cultivated both with equal precision. They used the countryside as their fortress, Farmhouses doubled as command centers, their walls echoing not with laughter but with plans. These were not places of camaraderie, but of obedience. No one raised their voice. No one questioned. Orders were given in tones quiet enough to be mistaken for prayer, and carried out with an efficiency that bordered on ritual. It was here that Riina sharpened his role, not the charming Don, not the eloquent negotiator, but the executioner in the shadows. He did not seduce his rivals. He erased them. He did not ask for loyalty. He demanded it, and if it did not come freely, he ensured it would not exist at all. The Mafia Commission, once a council of equals, began to fracture under the pressure. Palermo bosses, who had long grown used to their dominance, suddenly found themselves hemmed in, watching as their friends and associates fell one by one. By the late 1970s, the Corleonesi strategy was undeniable. They were not asking for a share, they were dismantling the hierarchy and replacing it with their own. The city streets reflected this change. Fear became the unspoken law. The ordinary people of Palermo, who had always known the mafia as a presence, now felt it as a weight. Conversations grew shorter. Doors closed earlier. The silence of neighborhoods spoke louder than gunshots. The Corleonesi had shifted the tone of Cosa Nostra itself. Where once there had been room for honor, for negotiation, now there was only obedience or death. What made Riina so distinct was not brilliance nor charisma. It was relentlessness. He did not pause. He did not tire. He was like stone, grinding down anything in his path. He had no need to justify himself. In his worldview, survival was the only argument, and fear was the only currency. He measured ambition not in wealth, not in the outward trappings of power, but in the silence that followed a rival's disappearance. By the time Palermo fully understood what was happening, it was already too late. The countryside peasants had become predators, and the city that had once mocked them now trembled under their shadow. The rise of the Corleonesi was not a story of brilliance, but of brutality refined into strategy. They were not scholars of tradition, nor men of romance. They were something far more unsettling, proof that, in the dark ecosystems of power, ruthlessness could achieve what elegance never could. In a matter of years, the tables had turned. No longer did Palermo dictate to Corleone. Corleone dictated to Palermo. The mafia had been reshaped, not by a vision, but by an absence of mercy, of hesitation, of any trace of humanity. And in that void, the Corleonesi found their throne. As the chapter closes, the city breathes differently. Doors are locked, whispers are softer, and behind every glance lies the unspoken knowledge that a new reign has begun. Palermo no longer mocks Corleone. Palermo fears it. Sicily, in the 1980s, did not breathe. It seemed to hold its lungs in a permanent suspension, as though the island itself feared the weight of sound. Streets bustled, children played, markets opened and closed. But beneath the ordinary rhythms lay a silence so profound it felt engineered. It was not the silence of peace or of restful nights. It was the silence of obedience, of a society bent under the weight of an invisible hand. That hand belonged to Salvatore Riina, the man who would be remembered not for his face, seldom seen, but for the climate he created, a reign not of loyalty, but of terror. The Corleonesi clan had risen from obscurity, a rural faction once considered too crude to rival Palermo's polished aristocracy of crime. Yet under Riina, they did more than rival them, they swallowed them whole. By the 1980s, every whisper, Every rumor, every hesitation to comply could be traced to him. Those who resisted dissolved like salt in water. Judges vanished. Politicians vanished. Entire names disappeared from telephone directories, as if whole families had never existed. It was not chaos. It was method. Riina's brutality was not random, though it could seem that way to the trembling public. It was systematic, deliberate, and profoundly efficient. He did not shoot wildly into the crowd. He selected, pruned, and cut down with an almost bureaucratic precision. A baker who spoke too freely about neighborhood dealings found himself erased from the morning routine. His shop shuttered without explanation. A city councilman who resisted a bribe was discovered missing, his office papers still scattered across his desk. Even men within the mafia, those who dared question Riina's decisions, were not spared. To stand against him, or even to stand too tall beside him, was to sign one's own disappearance. And so, people learned. They learned the rhythm of silence. They learned to keep their voices low in markets, to nod politely when strangers asked too many questions, to look away when black cars idled too long in the street. Fear was not merely an atmosphere, it became a language, a currency exchanged in every glance and every hesitation. In Palermo, conversations shifted like shadows. Friends who once spoke freely now circled their words, careful not to betray themselves by accident. Even within families, mistrust grew. Was it safe to tell one's brother about a bribe scene in the mayor's office? Was it safe to confide in a cousin about the thugs who lingered near the piazza? No one knew who might carry words back to ears that listened in silence. In this way, terror was not just physical, it was psychological. Riina had mastered the art of turning society against itself, of teaching people to police their own tongues. Teachers in classrooms grew cautious, editing history lessons so as not to provoke suspicion. Priests who once thundered against corruption softened their sermons, replacing fiery words with vague allusions. Even the boldest voices of conscience found themselves muffled. In Sicily, Riina's power was not the pistol, it was the thought lodged in every citizen's mind. What if someone hears me? What if someone repeats what I say? The press, too, faltered. Journalists, once relentless, began to trim their sentences, erasing names and smoothing details until their articles resembled shadows of truth rather than truth itself. To write too much was to court disappearance. To publish bravely was to leave one's family at the mercy of vengeance. And so, the pages grew quieter, and the public, deprived of voices, sank further into silence. The psychology of fear is simple in its cruelty. It demands no loyalty, only compliance. It does not seek love, only paralysis. Riina understood this better than anyone. He did not need to be seen in public squares or parade his power openly. His genius lay in his invisibility. He became a ghost that haunted every corridor, every whisper, every hesitation. His name traveled faster than he did decoing in markets, seeping into prayers muttered under breath, clinging to the backs of throats like smoke. This invisibility was his weapon. To his enemies, he seemed everywhere and nowhere at once. To the people, he became an omnipresent spectre, a figure whose absence was more terrifying than his presence. To be summoned by Riina did not always mean a meeting. Sometimes it meant only the sound of footsteps behind you, the car that followed too closely, the sudden disappearance of a neighbor who had been seen the day before. Fear filled the gaps where certainty used to reside. Life under such rule became theater. Men bowed lower, spoke softer, smiled more readily, not out of courtesy but survival. A handshake carried the weight of life and death, for to refuse was to risk being noted, remembered, and erased. Women crossing the market held their children close, not only to shield them from thieves, but from the invisible possibility that speaking out loud might bring consequence. The violence itself was often unseen by the public. What they witnessed were its traces: empty seats at church, shuttered windows, a child suddenly absent from the schoolyard. Sicily lived in a constant state of aftermath, forever digesting losses without ever seeing their moment of occurrence. It created a rhythm of dread, an expectation that at any moment another face might vanish, another name might fade into silence. What made Riina's reign singular was not his cruelty. Many mafiosi had killed before him, but the scale of his reach. He did not rule by alliances, nor by the old codes of honor that once structured the Cosa Nostra. He ruled by dread, by the understanding that he alone could decide who breathed and who did not. Even the highest-ranking bosses bowed before him, their pride ground into submission by the threat of erasure. To disobey was to disappear, and no one, not even the powerful, could afford invisibility. And so, Sicily in the 1980s moved in shadow. The cafes opened, the bells rang, the fishermen hauled their nets, but all of it unfolded under a dome of silence. A silence so suffocating it became its own form of death. Children grew up in it, absorbing the unspoken rules before they could write their own names. They learned quickly not to ask where someone had gone, not to question why an empty chair was left at a dinner table. Questions, after all, were dangerous. By the close of this decade, Salvatore Riina was no longer merely a man. He had become a condition, a climate, a force of nature in the Sicilian psyche. He was il capo dei capi, the boss of bosses, not because he inspired loyalty, but because he commanded fear so profound it hollowed out the island's spirit. And yet, in the stillness of that silence, a question lingered, barely whispered, never answered. How long could a people endure life beneath the weight of a ghost? How long before silence itself cracked, before the whispers grew too heavy to contain? The answer had not yet come. In the 1980s, fear still ruled, and Riina still watched, unseen. Everywhere, the story of Cosa Nostra could no longer be contained within the sun-bleached streets of Sicily. By the mid-2000s, Toto Riina's grip had extended across the water, reaching into the beating heart of mainland Italy. The pipelines of heroin, carefully threaded from Turkish suppliers through Sicilian ports and then onward across the Atlantic, brought rivers of wealth. Cash flowed as freely as blood had once spilled in village vendettas. With every transaction, the Mafia seemed less a local criminal brotherhood and more a shadow state-an empire that thrived in silence. Invisible but everywhere, yet power, like a flame, grows harder to conceal the brighter it burns. The expansion into the mainland brought Riina into direct collision with something far more dangerous than rival clans, the Italian state itself. Not the compromised officials who had long whispered bargains in back rooms, but a new kind of enemy. Men who chose to stand in the open, to say no, to drag the Cosa Nostra into the light of a courtroom. In Palermo, the mood was changing. The city had lived for decades under a pact of quiet submission. Everyone knew who held power, and everyone knew the price of defiance. But then came Giovanni Falcone, a magistrate with a sharp mind and an almost painful sense of duty. He worked not with flamboyance, but with quiet persistence, unraveling the threads of financial networks, tracing the invisible trails of drug money as if each account was a path toward truth. Alongside him stood Paolo Borsellino, his friend, his colleague, his shadow and mirror. Where Falcone carried the weight of analysis, Borsellino carried the fire of conviction. Together they became the embodiment of resistance. Not soldiers with guns, but men with pens, case files, and a belief that law could confront violence. Their offices became sanctuaries of fragile defiance. Piles of documents filled the air with the smell of ink and paper, cigarette smoke curling above stacks of evidence. Long nights blurred into mornings as they sifted through testimony, piecing together a mosaic of crime that stretched from Sicilian villages to New York skyscrapers. They knew, as did everyone around them, that their work signed their death warrants. And yet they stayed. Courtrooms, once places of ritual compromise, now became stages of confrontation. The Maxi trial in Palermo, overseen by Falcone and Borsellino, brought hundreds of mafiosi into the dock. Behind glass cages, men who had once walked untouchable through their neighborhoods now sat in silence, their faces impassive, their eyes burning with hatred. The atmosphere was electric fear, mixing with a strange, unfamiliar hope. For the first time, it seemed possible that the silence could be broken. But Riina was listening. To him, the trial was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a declaration of war. He had built his empire on fear, on the certainty that no one would dare speak against him. Now judges dared not only to speak, but to challenge him before the world. To Riina, there could be only one answer. The campaign of terror began slowly, with targeted killings in quiet streets. An official shot outside his home, a policeman ambushed on a morning commute. Each act carried the same message. Resistance was fatal, but Riina's fury grew bolder. No longer content with silencing individuals, he sought to shake the very foundation of the state. Bombs tore through public spaces, explosions that echoed across cities, announcing the mafia's power with brutal spectacle. Glass shattered, bodies fell, and Italy trembled. And yet, in the face of this carnage, Falcone and Borsellino pressed on. Their steps grew heavier, their movements more cautious, but their resolve deepened. They spoke rarely of fear, though it shadowed every moment of their lives. Friends recalled how Falcone would joke lightly when boarding flights, masking the knowledge that each journey might be his last. Borsellino carried the same calm, even as he whispered to those closest that he did not expect to live much longer. Their courage was not the absence of fear, but the acceptance of it. They understood that their deaths were likely inevitable, yet they refused to step aside. In their persistence lay a defiance more profound than violence itself. The refusal to yield to terror. The streets of Palermo became tense theaters of anticipation. Each assassination fed whispers of despair. What chance did two men have against an empire of shadows? Yet among the people, something unexpected stirred. Crowds began to gather outside courthouses, voices rising in fragile support. Ordinary citizens, long cowed into silence, dared to speak Falcone's name aloud with admiration, to see Borsellino as a hero rather than a doomed man. Still, Riina believed time was on his side. He had erased rivals before. He could erase magistrates now. His worldview was built on the certainty that no one could resist the inevitability of fear. But in this calculation, he misjudged the endurance of memory. For though his assassins could kill a man, they could not extinguish the echo of courage that lingered after. Each bombing left behind not only destruction but also questions. reflections, doubts. Who truly ruled Italy? The silent men with guns, or the weary judges who dared to sign their names beneath indictments? Every act of violence drew lines sharper between power and resistance, forcing the nation to confront its own conscience. By the late 1980s, blood stained not only Sicilian soil, but also the pavements of Rome. Florence, Milan, the mafia was no longer a local affliction. It was a national wound. The air carried both the acrid smoke of detonations and the fragile scent of defiance. Italy stood in mourning and in waiting, uncertain which force would prevail in those years. Falcone and Borsellino were already seen as men walking toward martyrdom. Friends described their laughter at dinner tables, the small joys they still permitted themselves, but always beneath it ran an undertone of inevitability. Each knew that death waited just beyond the next corner. And yet, when they rose in court, when they signed another file, when they walked into their offices, they carried themselves with the dignity of men who had already given their lives in service. The clash was no longer a matter of criminals and judges, but of two visions of humanity itself, one built on silence, fear, and blood, the other on fragile courage, spoken aloud even when trembling. As this chapter draws closed, the listener is left in the uneasy stillness of anticipation. Riina's power grows bolder, more violent, more desperate. Falcone and Borsellino grow more isolated, their lives narrowing into corridors of duty and looming fate. The collision is inevitable. The only unknown is when and at what cost. It began not with gunfire, nor with whispers in the alleys of Palermo, but with the turning of a key in a heavy iron lock. A door clanged shut, echoing through the reinforced halls of a structure unlike any courthouse Italy had ever known, built like a fortress, designed to withstand bombs and rocket launchers. This place was less a shrine to justice and more a bunker against war. It was here, in the mid-1980s, that the Italian state dared to drag the mafia into the light. The world would come to know it as the Maxi trial. Inside, the atmosphere felt suffocating. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke and tension, a mix of cologne and sweat lingering in a space that had ceased to be neutral ground. Rows upon rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of journalists, lawyers, policemen, and the curious spectators to a confrontation centuries in the making. And then, beyond steel bars, behind thick glass cages, sat the men themselves. Dozens, then hundreds, of figures who had long been untouchable in their towns, now reduced to prisoners staring out like caged animals. Some smiled defiantly, others sat stone-faced, their silence as eloquent as any words. For the first time, the veil was lifting. Names whispered in back rooms now echoed across the courtroom in official transcripts. Streets that had lived under the mafia's shadow saw their rulers unmasked before the nation. Yet this was no ordinary trial. It was theater, politics, and war all braided together. At its heart was one man who had broken the sacred vow of silence, the oath of a... His name was Tommaso Buscetta. Buscetta had once been a loyal mafioso, deeply embedded in the organization's inner workings. But betrayal, loss, and exile had pushed him toward an impossible choice: to die with secrets, or to live by revealing them. He chose the latter, and with his words, he opened the mafia's labyrinth to outsiders for the first time. His testimony was like a map drawn in blood, outlining the hierarchy, the rituals, the invisible chains of loyalty that bound men to Cosa Nostra. His voice, calm but steady, filled the chamber. Each sentence he spoke carried the weight of years of silence. He spoke of meetings in hidden villas, of orders whispered in the dark, of how power moved like an unseen current through Sicilian life. To the judges and prosecutors, he was a key to unlocking the mystery. To the men behind the bars, he was a traitor, a condemned soul walking freely only because the state sheltered him. The trial was not merely a battle of evidence. It was a battle of wills. Judges like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, men who had already placed their lives at risk, now faced the fury of an organization that had survived for generations by killing its enemies without hesitation. Every morning they walked into that bunker knowing that every step might be their last. They had armored cars, bodyguards, and routines designed to shake off pursuers. But deep inside they knew protection was never perfect. Still, they pressed on. Day after day, testimony after testimony, the trial crawled forward. Hundreds of defendants, thousands of pages of documents, endless cross-examination. For outsiders, it seemed a grind of legal procedure. But beneath the surface, it was war by other means. For Salvatore Riina, hidden in the shadows, this was nothing less than an existential threat. The walls were closing in. His world, once governed by invisible rules of silence and fear, was now bleeding into the open. Riina remained untouchable for the moment, free on the outside while his soldiers sat locked behind bars. Yet he was not idle. Even from hiding, he orchestrated a symphony of reprisals. Witnesses who dared speak began to vanish. Police officers who carried evidence met violent ends. Judges received death threats scrawled on scraps of paper or conveyed through brutal assassinations of colleagues. The message was clear. The Mafia would not go quietly. Every testimony given in court was balanced by blood spilled outside its walls. And yet, amid the fear, courage burned brighter. Men and women who had every reason to stay silent found their voices. Bustetta was not alone. Other pentiti informants, who had once sworn eternal loyalty, stepped forward. They carried not only secrets, but also the weight of conscience, the scars of lost families, and the hope that by speaking they might redeem themselves. Their words turned the courtroom into something larger than law, became a battlefield between truth and silence, between memory and erasure. The architecture itself reflected the stakes. The massive reinforced courtroom, built beside Palermo's prison, stood like a citadel against invisible armies. Its concrete walls bore the paranoia of an era when bombs in suitcases and bullets on motorcycles were as common as rain. Every door slammed like a warning. Every echo felt like it might conceal danger. The trial stretched on, not for weeks or months, but for years. From 1986 to 1992, it consumed lives and careers. Prosecutors grew older under its weight. Defendants wasted away behind bars, clinging to hope that appeals or intimidation might undo the state's work. Outside, ordinary Sicilians watched with wary eyes. Could justice finally prevail in a land where, for so long, the Mafia had been the invisible government? Or would this trial end like so many others, with technicalities, acquittals, and the quiet return of shadows? When the verdicts came, they thundered through Italy. Hundreds of convictions, sentences that piled up into centuries. For once it seemed, the state had struck a blow that mattered. The Mafia was not invincible. It could be named, exposed, punished. The applause of history seemed to echo, but in the silences between gavel strikes, unease lingered, because everyone knew Salvatore Riina was still free. The Beast of Corleone still walked in the open, untouched, unbroken, watching the trial unfold like a spectator at a play. And he had not forgotten. Convictions did not end the Mafia. They provoked it. Riina sharpened his revenge like a blade. Soon, his fury would spill into the streets of Palermo and beyond, claiming judges, officers, and innocents in a campaign of terror designed to remind Italy that the Mafia still dictated life and death. The Maxi trial was thus both triumph and omen. It revealed the Mafia's structure, shattered the myth of its invisibility, and proved that courage could momentarily outweigh fear. But it also set the stage for bloodier years ahead. Years where courage would demand the highest. Sacrifice, as the iron locks clanged shut once more, and the prisoners were led away. A silence hung in the courtroom. It was the silence of victory, fragile and fleeting. Outside, the Sicilian sun blazed against the concrete walls, as if to remind all who had witnessed this moment that the struggle was far from over. The trial had ended, but the war was only beginning. The year was 1992. In the history of Sicily, and of Italy itself, it would forever be remembered as l'anno di sangue, the year of blood. A year when shadows lengthened across the streets of Palermo, when fear gripped not just a region, but an entire nation. For decades the Mafia had killed, had silenced, had intimidated. But what happened in those months was different. This was not the quiet settling of scores in alleyways, nor the whispered assassinations of rivals. This was war declared in the open, with thunder and fire. The man behind it was Salvatore Riina, the Capo dei Capi, the Beast of Corleone. By the early 1990s, Riina had consolidated a brutal reign. He believed the state was weak, that politicians would forever bend, that fear would always silence resistance. But something had shifted. Years earlier, Judge Giovanni Falcone had launched a new kind of investigation, methodical, unrelenting, a legal architecture built to corner the untouchables. Alongside him, Judge Paolo Borsellino carried the same torch, both men knowing full well what it meant. They had marked themselves for death. The first blow fell on May 23, 1992. The spring afternoon seemed ordinary in the suburbs outside Palermo. The air was bright, the Mediterranean sun casting its light across the asphalt of the A29 motorway. Then suddenly, the earth itself seemed to convulse. Beneath the road, half a ton of explosives, buried by Riina's men, erupted. The sound was not a mere explosion, but a tearing apart of silence, a roar that shook windows miles away. Judge Giovanni Falcone, his wife Francesca, and 3 members of his security detail were killed instantly. The scene was apocalyptic. Asphalt lifted like torn fabric, cars hurled into the air, black smoke rising as if from the bowels of the earth. Rescue workers later recalled the smell burning metal, blood, dust, and the bitter tang of explosives lingering in the heat. News spread within minutes. Italy had known mafia killings before, but never something so brazen, so militaristic, so designed to make the world watch. The funeral became a moment etched in the nation's memory. Thousands crowded into Palermo's cathedral. Judges, priests, schoolchildren, ordinary shopkeepers, awed, stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces marked with grief and disbelief. On live television, the widow of one of Falcone's bodyguards stood before Italy's political elite and screamed her fury at them. "Where were you?" she demanded. "Where were you when these men stood alone?" Her words pierced through marble walls and television screens, exposing the impotence and hypocrisy of those who had turned away for too long. Yet even before the tears had dried, the beast struck again. On July 19th, less than 2 months after Falcone's assassination, Paolo Borsellino was killed. The judge had known it was coming. Friends remembered how he spoke of death as a companion walking beside him. That summer afternoon, as he visited his mother's house on Via d'Amelio, a car parked outside exploded with such force that it shattered windows across Palermo. Borsellino and 5 of his escort were obliterated in an instant. 2 judges, 2 symbols of courage, gone within 57 days. The mafia had bared its teeth, and the message was clear. No one was safe. Not even those who represented the highest ideals of justice. Italy wept again. Another funeral, another gathering of thousands in the cathedral. But something had changed. The grief was no longer only disparate, was anger, raw and uncontainable. Citizens who had once whispered their hatred of Cosa Nostra now shouted it in the streets. In schoolyards, children wrote letters to Falcone and Borsellino, promising they would not forget. Candlelit vigils stretched through Palermo's nights, flames flickering against the darkness as if to say, the silence has ended. For Riina, these murders were triumphs. In his mind, they proved his power, his ability to terrify not only Sicily but Rome itself. His arrogance was absolute. He had reached beyond the boundaries of shadow into the very center of national life. The state, he believed, would retreat once more. But history rarely bends forever in one direction. The spectacle of violence had consequences Riina could not foresee. In killing Falcone and Borsellino, he created martyrs. Their names became banners beneath which Italians rallied. Politicians, who had wavered now, found themselves cornered by public outrage. Anti-mafia laws hardened. New units were formed, networks expanded, and the state finally moved with an intensity long overdue. The paradox of power was laid bare. Riina's strength was real, but it was also brittle. He could kill judges, yes. He could terrify cities. But he could not extinguish memory, nor could he control the tide of human resolve once it had been stirred in the streets of Palermo. Whispers became open defiance. Shopkeepers, who had long paid Pizzotha Mafia's extortion tax, began quietly refusing. Young activists carried banners that read, "A people that pays, dies. A people that does not, lives." The air carried both fear and determination, mingled like the scents of citrus groves and car exhaust. Sicily was bleeding, but it was also awakening. Still, the summer of 1992 remained heavy with dread. People spoke of the assassinations in hushed tones, as though words themselves could invite death. Parents warned children not to linger in groups, not to speak too loudly of their opinions. Every parked car, every unattended suitcase, carried the possibility of another explosion. The beast had shown that life itself could be reduced to a trigger, a fuse, a detonation. And yet, against this backdrop of terror, the memory of Falcone and Borsellino endured. In schools, teachers spoke of them as heroes, not victims. In churches, priests invoked their names in sermons. Their portraits appeared on walls, in offices, in homes. The mafia had tried to erase them with fire, but had instead carved them into stone. By the close of that year, one truth was undeniable. Riina had overreached. He had mistaken fear for permanence. But fear, when stretched too far, breaks. He had sown not only death, but resistance. The blood spilled on the roads of Palermo had watered a new kind of courage. The year of blood was also the beginning of the beast's end. The winter of 1993 in Palermo was grey and restless. The city bore the weight of decades of fear. Streets that had once echoed with laughter carried instead the silence of suspicion. Windows closed early, doors locked tight, and conversations carried whispers rather than voices. It was here, among cracked walls and weathered shutters, that the unthinkable unfolded. The arrest of Salvatore Riina, the man who had loomed over Sicily like a shadow for more than 20 years. The capture did not erupt in flames or gunfire. There were no cinematic gun battles, no defiant last stands. Instead, it came quietly, almost unceremoniously, on a January morning. Riina, the Beast of Corleone, a man accused of ordering murders that had scarred the nation, was stopped in Palermo not as a figure of terror but as a weary man slipping into a car. His life as a fugitive had ended not in violence but in stillness. For years he had hidden in plain sight. He lived not in a remote cave or foreign city, but in a modest apartment in Palermo, just a few kilometers from the very prosecutors and police forces who had pursued him. He blended into the ordinary fabric of Sicilian life, a quiet resident, unremarkable, almost invisible. The irony was brutal. The most hunted man in Italy was hiding behind the face of ordinariness. The operation that led to his downfall was the result of persistence more than luck. Italy's anti-mafia forces had spent years chipping away at his empire, gathering fragments of intelligence, pressing informants, and watching for the smallest slip. Betrayal played its part. As so often in the world of organized crime, loyalty proved fragile, and whispers of Riina's whereabouts trickled out from within the very walls of his network. The man who had demanded silence Omerta was undone by voices, too tired to remain faithful. When police finally stopped the car carrying Riina, the moment carried no grandeur. He did not resist. He did not rage. Instead, he stepped into custody, as though fate had simply reached the end of its patience. Officers later described his demeanor as subdued, almost indifferent, as if he understood that this was not a defeat, but a turning of the page in a story that was far from over. Yet for those who had lived in his shadow, the arrest was nothing less than seismic. The people of Palermo and of Italy itself had endured years of bombings, assassinations, and fear. Riina had orchestrated the killings of judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, whose deaths had shaken the nation to its core. He had ordered blood to flow through the streets in a calculated display of power. To see him led away in handcuffs, small, pale, unassuming, was a sight that carried both relief and disbelief. In photographs, the contrast was stark. Riina, short and stocky, looked more like a shopkeeper than a man who had commanded armies of killers. But that ordinariness was the essence of his terror. He embodied the banality of evil, a man capable of monstrous decisions who appeared utterly unremarkable. The image of him between police officers, swallowed by coats and shadows, became a symbol in itself, a reminder that the colossal fear he inspired had always been sustained by silence and obedience. The arrest did not bring an end to the mafia. It did not erase the scars or resurrect the lost. The network Riina had built continued to breathe, its roots sunk deep into the soil of Sicily, its branches reaching into politics, business, and daily life. The Cosa Nostra was never the creation of one man alone, and it would not collapse with his capture. What had been achieved was a victory, yes, but a fragile one. A pause in a war still raging beneath the surface. For prosecutors and police, the moment was bittersweet. There was satisfaction in seeing him taken, but also the hollow recognition of how much had already been lost. Giovanni, Falcone, and Paolo Borsellino were gone, their absence heavier than the presence of Riina in custody. The families of countless victims still carried their grief like open wounds. The prisons might hold the man, but they could not contain the damage he had unleashed. Journalists at the time spoke of Palermo breathing again, as though the city had been suffocating and could finally take a cautious inhale. But it was not the air of celebration. It was the air of exhaustion. Relief was tempered by doubt. Was this truly an end, or merely the beginning of another chapter in an endless struggle? The symbolism was impossible to ignore. For decades, Riina had thrived in the shadows, cloaked in myth and menace. Now, stripped of that aura, he was revealed as a fragile figure, escorted by the very forces he had once mocked. The beast was caged, but the forest he ruled still rustled with predators. On the streets of Sicily, reactions varied. Some cheered, some whispered prayers of gratitude, while others kept their expressions blank, unwilling to betray too much in public. Fear, after all, does not vanish with a single arrest. The Mafia had long taught its people the cost of open defiance, and memories of bloodshed lingered as Riina's trial loomed. Italy reflected not only on the man, but on the system he represented. His capture raised questions larger than his life. What is justice in the face of such wounds? Can one man's imprisonment balance decades of violence? Or does true justice lie elsewhere in the courage to dismantle the structures that allowed him to rise in the first place? In that January, history itself seemed to pause. It was as though the island had exhaled after years of suffocation. The silence that followed was both heavy and fragile, carrying with it a weight of uncertainty. Riina's fall was not an ending, but a moment suspended between what had been and what was yet to come. And so, as he sat behind bars, the world outside shifted slightly. Palermo walked its streets with a little less fear, though not without shadows. The man who once commanded silence was himself silenced, confined to a cell. But the deeper question remained whether his capture was justice fulfilled or merely justice deferred, waiting still in the hearts of those who had suffered. The fall of Salvatore Riina was not a victory song. It was a somber note, a reminder that the story of the Mafia was not the story of one man, but of an entire system entwined with Sicily's history. And as that note lingered, Italy asked itself the question that still haunts its memory. When wounds run so deep, can justice ever truly be enough? The iron doors closed with a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should. A heavy metallic thud reverberating through stone corridors. For a man who once commanded silence across an entire island, Salvatore Toto Riina now found himself drowned in the silence of a cell. It was not the silence of fear, nor the silence of conspiracies whispered in candlelit rooms. This was a sterile silence imposed by walls, by bars, by the watchful eyes of guards who cared little for the name that had once terrified Sicily. Prison, for most men, is punishment. For Riina, it was a kind of insult. To cage the beast, as he had been called, was to take a creature born of shadows and lock him beneath fluorescent lights. Yet even here, within a bare cell of concrete and iron, Riina was not entirely powerless. He carried himself as if the walls could not contain him, as if influence seeped through cracks and spread across Italy like a scent. Loyal messengers came and went, carefully chosen words passed in visiting rooms, and somehow violence outside still bore his fingerprints. Judges were threatened, rivals silenced, contracts fulfilled. It was proof that even when trapped, he remained a presence, an echo that refused to die. And yet, something had shifted. The grip he once held over Sicily absolute, suffocating, was now fragmented. Orders no longer travelled at the speed of fear. They were delayed, intercepted, weakened in translation. Riina's power flickered like a candle in its final hours, casting long, distorted shadows, but struggling against the draft of time. Outside his cell, new leaders rose, younger men who claimed his throne but never fully matched his aura. Inside, the man who had once dined in secrecy, who had commanded empires of blood and silence, now ate from plastic trays under the eyes of indifferent guards. Courtrooms became his stage, though not willingly. He shuffled into hearings with the defiance of a man who would never bow. Unrepentant, he glared at judges, sometimes shouting, sometimes smirking, always carrying himself as if still in control. His contempt was palpable. In his mind, these trials were not justice, they were theatre, designed by the state to parade his downfall. But the irony was unshakable. The same man who once silenced prosecutors with bombs now had no choice but to listen to their voices echoing off marble halls. Time became his enemy, more formidable than the law. The years pressed in on him, each day measured not in victories but in routine. Guards noted his movements, his health, the gradual erosion of a man who had once been untouchable. He aged in that cell. His body, once carrying the vitality of a predator, weakened. His steps slowed, his hands trembled. The beast was still a beast, but caged, frail, his roar reduced to a rasp dot. And yet Sicily did not forget. His name continued to hover over the island, invoked in whispers, in warnings to children, in the hesitant pride of those who dared to speak of justice. But the land itself began to change. Schools were named after Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, the magistrates murdered by Riina's command. Children grew up reciting their stories, voices rising in classrooms that would once have been silent. Murals appeared on crumbling walls, bright paint standing in defiance of mafia darkness. Streets that had once been patrolled by fear were now guarded by memory, by the stubborn resilience of people who refused to let the past repeat itself. The contrast was stark. Inside a cell, Riina fought against irrelevance, clinging to control that slipped further from his grasp each year. Outside, Sicily breathed differently. The funerals of the 1990s had given way to festivals of remembrance, not of despair, but of resilience. It was as if the island itself had chosen to grow while he withered. Prison is a peculiar kind of mirror. It reflects back not only the man inside, but the world he once shaped. Riina, sitting on a narrow cot in the half-light of dawn, was not merely an old man awaiting the inevitable. He was a living contradiction, feared and powerless, remembered yet diminishing, still the beast, but reduced to a shadow behind bars. His empire, built on fear, had not entirely vanished, but it no longer ruled unchallenged. It was diluted, dispersed, transformed into something he could no longer fully command. Occasionally, journalists speculated about his state of mind. Was he remorseful? Did the weight of the murdered judge's children, innocence caught in the blast of his ambitions, press upon his conscience in sleepless nights? But those who saw him, who heard his words in court, knew otherwise. There was no repentance. Riina wore his silence as armor. If he regretted anything, it was not the blood, but the bars. He had always believed himself destined to outlast justice, and in prison he clung to that belief, even as his body betrayed him. In the end, it was not the police, nor the state, nor the shifting tides of Sicily that claimed him. It was time, an enemy no one could outwit. Slowly, inevitably, It stripped him of strength, of command, of breath, and yet, until his final days, he remained unbroken in posture, unyielding in gaze, determined to project the same aura of defiance that had carried him through decades of violence. The island, meanwhile, continued to whisper his name, though differently now. Once it was a name spoken in fear, muttered in alleyways, avoided in public. Now it was uttered as a reminder, a cautionary tale, the symbol of a chapter Sicily had endured and chosen to resist. The murals, the schools, the young voices learning about Falcone and Borsellino, they were not merely acts of memory, but acts of defiance. Each brushstroke of color, each story told in a classroom, was a chain around Riina's legacy, binding it not to glory but to warning. And so the beast remained in his cage, roaring silently against the passing years. But beyond those bars, Sicily was no longer entirely his. The streets carried a different rhythm, the markets hummed with a different kind of chatter, and children grew up knowing that monsters could be defeated, not by guns, not by bombs, but by time, by memory, by the stubborn refusal of a people to forget. It is perhaps the deepest irony of all. Riina, who built his empire on silence, now spends eternity remembered not in silence but in the voices of a generation raised to resist him. His cell may have been small, but its shadow stretched across history. And in that shadow, Sicily learned to find its light. The road back to Corleone is quiet now. Olive trees sway on the hillsides, their leaves glinting silver under the Sicilian sun. The same streets where whispers once curled like smoke through doorways are lined with shuttered windows, their wood weathered, their stones unchanged. Yet beneath this stillness, beneath the hum of cicadas and the perfume of lemon groves, there lingers an absence that feels heavier than presence. It is the absence of Salvatore Riina, not his body, not his voice, but the shadow of his reign, a shadow that refuses to dissipate even decades after his fall. For some, his memory is not of the man himself, but of what he demanded. Silence. Silence in courtrooms, silence in neighborhoods, silence in the faces of mothers who buried sons they were never allowed to name aloud. It is a silence that still clings, invisible but felt. In the walls of Corleone's houses, in the pauses of its conversations, Riina was no figure of romantic legend. His life does not sit comfortably beside the mythologies of cinema, the noble outlaws, the charming dawns with a code of honor. His was a story stripped bare of elegance. He was both disciplined and destructive, calculating and reckless, a paradox embodied in flesh. Respected by those who feared him, reviled by those who survived him. He cultivated power not through admiration but through terror's endurance. And yet, as history often does, his figure bends and shifts with time. For the young Riina is more phantom than flesh, a name they hear in passing, Il Capo dei Capi, the boss of bosses, a cautionary echo carried like a warning in the local air. For the old, he remains sharper, the memory of funerals that followed too closely, the empty chairs at tables, the feeling that safety was a foreign concept, a luxury denied to ordinary people. The paradox of Riina's legacy lies here. On one hand, the system he fortified has weakened. The mafia, though still present, no longer moves with the same unchecked swagger. State institutions are stronger, laws more watchful, voices more willing to break the silence. But on the other hand, the shadows remain. They remain in the entanglements between politics and crime. in the way business and silence sometimes walk hand in hand, in the subtle fear that power never truly vanishes but merely changes its face. If one were to walk through Corleone today, they might see children chasing soccer balls down sunlit alleys, tourists pausing to photograph doorways or dine on pasta beneath striped awnings. Life, in its stubborn resilience, continues. Yet ask an elder, one who lived through Riina's years, and they might lower their voice, glancing around before answering. It is not so much that the danger is still immediate, it is that memory itself carries a kind of weight. Some wounds leave scars, not on the skin, but in the air itself. In this way, Riina's ghost is unlike the ghosts of emperors or saints. There are no statues raised to him, no monuments bearing his likeness, no commemorations carved in stone. His presence endures, instead, in the absences he left behind, in the systems he manipulated, the silences he enforced, the fear he cultivated like a dark crop. He is remembered in the empty corners of conversations, in the hesitation before a name is spoken. It is tempting, in stories like these, to search for resolution, to imagine a line where history can declare, here the monster was defeated, here justice prevailed. But Sicily resists such simplicity. The truth is more like the coastline itself, jagged, shifting, beautiful and perilous all at once. Riina was captured, imprisoned, condemned. His reign ended. Yet the very networks he built did not dissolve with him. They adapted. They survived, as shadows do, by clinging to corners where light is thinnest. So the question lingers, unanswered. What does it mean to defeat such a figure? Is justice the locking away of one man, or is it the unraveling of the silence he commanded? Can the balance of so much blood, so many lives stolen or silenced, ever truly be restored? Or does history, with its relentless turning, merely hand the shadows new names, new faces, while the old ones fade into myth? As the chapter closes, the tone is not triumph, but elegy. Riina's legacy is not one of glory, but of caution, a reminder of what ambition, unchecked by conscience, can cost. His story warns not only Sicily, but every place where power can grow unchecked, where silence can be purchased, where fear can become a currency stronger than gold. And yet, Sicily itself remains. The island, with its rugged cliffs and rolling hills, its citrus orchards and salt-stained harbors, has endured centuries of conquerors, tyrants, and kings. Riina was but one more figure in that long procession, a man who rose from poverty, seized power, and left his scars behind. But the land itself continues, carrying both its beauty and its memory. Picture it now, the cathedral bells tolling at dusk, the sound carrying across tiled rooftops, a shepherd guiding his flock home along narrow paths, families gathering at long tables as olive oil gleams beneath the low light of evening. Life goes on, and within that life, the shadow of Riina lingers, not dominating, but reminding that darkness can take root in silence, that fear can become a language, that justice is never final but always fragile. His name, once spoken in whispers of dread, is now carried with less urgency, more distance. Perhaps this is how history softens its monsters, not with forgiveness, but with time. The Beast of Corleone is no longer feared in the immediacy of the present, but he is remembered, and in that remembering lies the cautionary tale by the end. The audience is left, not with closure, but with reflection. The hills of Corleone stand, their stones unchanged. The sky burns orange at sunset, as it always has, Children laugh. Elders remember. The Mafia still breathes, though weakened, its shape altered but not erased. And somewhere, in the spaces between memory and silence, Riina's shadow moves less a figure now than a reminder. The story ends softly, as a requiem fades into silence. Not with triumph, not with absolution, but with the image of Sicily's beauty enduring, forever marked by the memory of its beast.